So here we go. This is part number 3 in a series we've been exploring together called One Anothering. And in the series, we've been trying to explore the fact that the Bible encourages us as God's people to get together and be a part of one another's lives in community. That's what the church is. And being the church, we are to be devoted to each other and committed to one another's spiritual development and growth, to be supportive and encouragement and at times admonish one another toward moving toward that goal of Christian maturity and knowing Jesus in deeper and richer ways. And so as we've explored that together, we're now in part number 3, and today I want to talk about the need in our relationships with each other for 2 things that need to happen at the same time. One is empathy, and the other is healthy boundaries. So this morning, the title of the lesson I have chosen is Empathetic Boundaries. And so we're going to look at each one of those in turn, and then I hope you'll see how it all comes together in the end. First of all, let's look at the fact that in our relationships and our dealings with each other, in human relationships generally, but especially in the church, in our one anothering, we have a need to be empathetic toward each other. The word empathy is a relatively new word in the English language that came into use, we believe, somewhere around 1903 when a psychologist translated a German word that means the ability to understand and appreciate another person's feelings or experience. So that's what empathy is the ability that you have. And by the way, some of us have that seemingly more naturally than others. And yet, it is a muscle, we might say, that can be exercised and strengthened in all of us. And that is the ability to understand and appreciate another person's feelings and experience. So, that particular skill, many people would say, generally comes more naturally in women. That may be somewhat of a generalization, but it seems as if women generally do that more naturally and automatically than men do. However, the word empathy means that you have an appreciation for the way somebody else feels, but not only an appreciation for it and an understanding of it, but then you respond to it with an appropriate emotion in response. That is empathy. Now, the English word compassion is much older. It dates back, we believe, somewhere around 1340 AD. And that English word compassion reflects a long-standing Christian tradition. For example, in the King James Version of the Bible, in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 14, Jesus, the scripture says, saw the multitudes and was moved with compassion on them, and he healed their sick. So the word compassion, as we see it used there, and the way that Jesus is moved with compassion, that word there in the original text means, the word compassion, translated in English compassion, means to be moved in the inward parts. And that's the reason why you'll often read in the King James Version, bowels of mercy, which is a very antiquated and odd way of saying it. But the reason the King James Version translated it that way, bowels of mercy, is because the word compassion, that we use compassion, the word that is original to the Bible, means that you are moved within your innermost being. In other words, within your emotions, the seat of your emotions, you feel something toward someone else in their plight or in their situation. And so that feeling that you have within you, as we see Jesus in Matthew 14:14, is more than just an emotional response, but it is an emotional response that moves into action. He was moved with compassion. He felt something when he saw their plight, and he moved into action as a result. So, the Christian virtue of compassion involves, on the one hand, as one writer put it, the feminine strength of empathy combined with the male concern for problem solving. So you put those two together, and that's biblical compassion. It is having empathy where you feel what another person is feeling, but you don't stop there. You feel it, and then you do what you can to step in and help in the situation. Jesus was moved with compassion when he saw the people, and then he healed their sick. Now, one particular writer, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his work on this. Wallace Stringer says that our culture today has undergone what he calls an empathectomy. In other words, empathy seems to have been almost surgically removed from the hearts of many people in our current culture and has turned us into what he calls moral monsters. Now, that may be a bit of an overstatement to say that we have had an empathectomy, that the virtue of compassion has been surgically removed and turned us all into moral monsters. But I do believe, however, that I think we might all agree that our culture is currently suffering from a lack of compassion. And Jesus told us it would be the case. In Matthew 24 and verse 12, Jesus is talking about what would happen in the latter days. And Jesus says that wickedness will increase in the world. And as wickedness increases, people's love will grow cold. So the more we see our world turning toward wicked ways, if we're not careful, we can experience a coldness of our compassion and experience an empathectomy where our empathy, our compassion is hardened against people. And we must guard against that, church. We are called as followers of Jesus to be people who, like him, are moved with compassion, that we are touched by the hurts and pains of the people around us, that we are not somehow hardened or against that or not compassionate against what people are feeling. In fact, the essence of the kingdom of the heavens is to help people who are hurting. The Bible is full of examples, but perhaps the most stark of these is when Jesus' own brother James in his epistle says that we should obey the royal law. Now, what is the royal law? He says the royal law is to love your neighbor as yourself, James chapter 2 and verse 8. In fact, James would say a chapter earlier in chapter 1 and verse 27 that the essence of true religion, of genuine religion, is to come to the aid of those that are the misfortunate, those that are the neglected, those that are the outcast, to care for the widows and the orphans in their affliction. This is the essence of true religion. So, true compassion, which is what we're called to, is empathy moved into action. And this is something that we need to focus on and strengthen, I think, in all of our lives if we've been tempted to become somehow calloused toward the hurts and pains of those around us in the midst of the dark and crooked and perverse generation in which we live. We need to rekindle our empathy, the need for compassion for the people around us. So we're called to do that. In fact, to follow Jesus means sacrificial service. To follow Jesus means that you are a giver who's not just concerned about your own needs, but you're concerned about the interest of others, Philippians chapter 2. But the question is, if we're really being sacrificial in our service, and we really are radical givers to the people around us, won't that make us doormats for the world? Will that make us an easy target for people who want to take advantage of our goodwill and generosity? In fact, it is the case that toxic people will often target people that show empathy and take advantage of that compassion. So you see, we have to balance the need for empathy with our need for healthy boundaries. In fact, sometimes we need to say no to some things in order to protect ourselves physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Jesus said it in Matthew 5:37, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Jesus is saying as Christians, there are times we need to say no to things and let our no be no. So exactly what are healthy boundaries? What does it mean to set a boundary in your life? Setting a boundary is a form of self-care. It's where you're taking care of your own well-being, where you're protecting your personal or your mental space by creating guidelines for yourself within relationships. Setting a boundary is having the courage to love yourself, to respect yourself, and to protect what has been entrusted to you, even at the risk of disappointing others around you. So you say, well, now, is that biblical? Is it biblical to set boundaries in your life, to practice self-care, where you're making sure to love and respect yourself, even at the risk of disappointing others? Well, let me give you several examples. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 6, Jesus said, this is Jesus now, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7 verse 6, don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample your pearls and then turn and attack you. You see, what Jesus is indicating here is that you can protect yourself, and most likely should protect yourself, from ungrateful people. Don't waste good things on people who don't appreciate them. We should be discerning and use wisdom when we're using our heart, our time, our talent, and our resources to say, how are those resources best spent? Don't cast your pearls before the swine. Because if you try to do good toward people that don't appreciate it, not only might you be wasting the pearls, but they may turn and attack you for your very goodwill intention. Now, another example, Matthew chapter 10, verses 13 and 15. It's there that Jesus sends his disciples out on the limited commission. And he tells them to go into all these towns and cities and to preach the gospel of the kingdom. And he says, you'll go into one particular village perhaps and knock on a door, and someone will welcome you. And if they welcome you, let the welcome be there upon you. And you go and enjoy the hospitality that is extended to you and preach the gospel to them. However, you may go to some village or some home and they do not receive you. And if they do not receive you, he says, you shake the dust from your feet. Jesus said, I am sending you out as sheep among wolves. Be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. Do you see the balance there? Be shrewd, be wise, exercise clear thinking in the way you interact with people. Shrewd as serpents, but then you be compassionate. Don't let it steal your compassion or empathy. Be as innocent as doves. So, you may go into someone's house and they don't receive you. They don't receive your message. Jesus is saying don't waste time on toxic or evil people. Sometimes it's okay to move on. Now, certainly we would pray for those individuals that there would be a change of heart in those individuals. And then we might circle back to them. But don't waste your time. He says you move on to the next one. Shake the dust from your feet and move on to the next one. Another example would be Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 to 50. Jesus' mothers and brothers, Jesus in this account, Matthew 12, Jesus is teaching his disciples. And in the midst of his teaching, the scripture says his mother and his brothers want to speak to him. And it comes to his attention. Word comes through the crowd. Jesus, your mother and your brothers are here. And Jesus said, who are my mother? Who is my mother? And who are my brothers? The ones that is my mother and my brothers are the ones that obey my teaching. So Jesus, you see, was not going to give in to his family trying to use their relationship with him to pull him away from the good work he's involved in. He shut that down. Sometimes family will play the entitlement card, and Jesus was not okay with that. Another example would be Galatians chapter 6 and verse 5. It's there that the Apostle Paul says, each one should carry their own load. You know, it's not uncommon for some people in our lives to want us to do for them what they could do for themselves. They may try to manipulate you or try to act desperate around you. But the passage here says each one should carry their own load. And yet, that's in verse 5. Back in verse 2, he says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law. Do you see this balance here? Bear one another's burdens. So I think both of these passages put together here in the same context are not contradictory, but in rather are complementary one of the other. And Paul is saying here that we should help people when they are truly in need of help. Otherwise, they should carry their own load. So maybe an illustration of this would be, imagine you go on a hike with some friends. And you get a few miles into the hike, and one of your friends starts to complain about carrying their backpack. And they begin to try to demand that you carry their backpack for them. And they maybe put a guilt trip on you, or they try to manipulate you in some way to carry my backpack. You need to carry your own load. However, let's say your friend sprains his ankle. In that situation, you would gladly take their backpack from them because it has now become a burden that they cannot bear. So I think that's what Paul is talking about there in Galatians 5. Now, in Galatians 6. Now, a few verses later, in verse number 7, Paul reminds us of a principle that God laid down long before Paul wrote. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament. And really, it goes all the way back to the very nature of the way God created the world. Whenever he says, you reap what you sow. You see, if you help people to continually escape the consequences of their own bad behavior, if you're always bailing them out or enabling them in their bad behavior, you are short-circuiting God's law of sowing and reaping. God means for us to experience some of the consequences of the choices we make in order to grow and learn from those mistakes. And so we need to be very careful about creating boundaries in our lives where we're not short-circuiting God's law of sowing and reaping. Now, going back to Jesus' example, the example of Jesus, in Luke chapter 5, verse 16, and this is just one example of many within the Gospels, where the Scripture says that Jesus had the most important pressing work in the world. There were people to heal, people to minister, time on this earth for him to do the work the Father sent for him to do. And he was busy. And yet, even in that short window of 3 years of ministry, Jesus knew there were times he needed to withdraw from the crowds. He needed to have some healthy boundaries. Where if he was continually pouring himself out and never having a time when he says no, so that he can have himself refreshed and replenished, he would have nothing from which to give and serve and minister. So Jesus would withdraw from the crowds to a quiet place to pray. You see, Jesus himself had boundaries that he put into place, and so should we, in order to honor and respect the very things that God has entrusted to us. Now, I know, and I knew it when I wrote the sermon, and I see it on some faces during the sermon. I knew. If you are naturally an empathetic person, the first part of the sermon today, you were in hearty agreement with, that we need to be people that are devoted to compassion and empathy. But when I got to this part about boundaries, everything in you was cringing. We may tend to think that saying no is uncompassionate or even unchristian. But I want to give some clarity here about this concept of boundaries. Because having boundaries is not always about shutting people out of your life or pushing people away. Now, sometimes that's an extreme last resort that has to be put into place. But having boundaries is not always about that. And having boundaries is not about being selfish. Boundaries they are not about putting up walls and moats around your heart where you don't get close to anybody. That's not a proper understanding of boundaries. Boundaries need to be put in place in your life before the people in your life cross the line, not just after they cross the line. Boundaries, you see, is refusing to allow others to determine your worth and refusing to allow others to have authority over your life. According to the best-selling author and research professor Brene Brown, she has done a lot of work on this idea of empathy and boundaries and compassion. She's made some really great observations and discoveries through her work. And she says that she has found that through many studies that have been done, that the people that have the best boundaries are actually the most compassionate people. Let me repeat that. People that have the best boundaries actually are the ones that have the most compassion. Now think about it from a biblical standpoint. Let's see if she's right. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That means that you are only positioned to be able to love others around you well when you first have respect and love for yourself, where you know what your thresholds are. You know where your limits are. Boundaries, you see, are the key to self-love. You can only love your neighbor as yourself if you first love yourself. You cannot give to others what you don't yet have for yourself. And so in order to love yourself well, boundaries are the key. And here's why. I won't ask for a witness or a raising of hands here, but I would suspect many of us can relate of what it's like to give yourself over and over and over again sacrificially, give, to the point that you experience what might be called compassion fatigue. And if you've ever experienced compassion fatigue, where you have said yes to everything, when you finally get to that point of being burnt out on compassion, then you become extremely irritable and extremely uncompassionate. So in order to be consistently compassionate with people, we have to guard ourselves from getting to the point where we have fatigue from being compassionate and we become uncompassionate and irritable. And the way to do that, the key to doing that, is putting good boundaries in our lives where we actually position ourselves to be more consistently compassionate toward other people. Brene Brown put it in a very ironic way when she was talking about it. She said that she has learned personally through establishing good boundaries in her life. She said, "I may not be as sweet as I used to be, but I'm much more loving." Now stop and think about that. If you've done the hard work to set good boundaries, then you will not grow weary of doing good. You will have the reserves from which to love others well. Boundaries are not fake walls and division. Good boundaries are about respect. Respecting yourself and respecting other people around you. So, as we bring this together, I'm convinced that in order to have good relationships with the people around us and to one another well in the church, that we need to have a healthy balance of the need for empathy and the need for boundaries. And we need to have both of them clearly in place. In fact, I'm convinced that is the heart of what it means to follow Jesus. And follow me on this. We have to be, church, compassionate people with firm convictions. We have to be compassionate people with firm convictions. The path of Jesus is to have firm boundaries while keeping a kind and open heart. Some of us, you see, tend to lean on one more than the other. In fact, I don't know, I know sometimes it's, I preach most all the sermons that I hear, but I listen to sermons too from others. And sometimes listening to a sermon, you hear bits and pieces and you capture the parts you like and you discard the rest. Well, let me just bring us all together now at this part. And if you don't hear anything else, I want you to hear this. Are you listening? Yes. Do not use the principle of boundaries to justify being a person who doesn't have compassion for people. Don't do that. That's not Christian. Likewise, don't use the principle of empathy to justify your lack of making good decisions and having good boundaries in your relationships. You see, perhaps you are a person who is very easily a truth teller, but you're not very empathetic. Or maybe you're somebody who's very compassionate, but you easily compromise your convictions. Both are imbalanced. Church, we have to keep open hearts, but also guard our hearts. Truth without empathy is sin. Jesus said this of the Pharisees in Matthew 23:4. He says, you like to tie heavy loads on people without being willing to even move a finger to help them. They love to be truth tellers, but they didn't have any compassion or empathy for people, and that's sin. But likewise, to have empathy without truth is sin as well. If you say you love somebody, but you keep the truth from them, you're not really loving them. Church, we have to hold this balance of empathy and boundaries. And you say, well, where does the Bible, you try to build a case for that, but where does the Bible use that language? Because I started the sermon by admitting to you that empathy is a relatively new word. You will not find the word empathy in the Bible. And compassion, although found in your Bible, is a relatively new English word, much older than empathy. It is a new English word that's trying to communicate this feeling from the depths of your emotions, the bowels of mercy. So where does the Bible balance this? Here's where it does. John tells us that the law came through Moses. John 1 and verse 17. But when Jesus came, he brought grace and truth. Grace and truth. We have to be people like Jesus who show grace to people. That's compassion. But then also we're truthful with people and we have healthy boundaries about standing firm with our convictions. But at the same token, the Apostle Paul would say when we go out and we talk to people, Ephesians 4 and verse 15 says you need to speak the truth in love. Do you see the balance? Have compassion and love for people, but then speak the truth to them. I will tell you, church, it is extremely easy to be a person who loves to go around telling people the truth, but you're not very loving about it. And that's damaging. But it's equally damaging to go around loving everybody and keeping the truth from them. That's equally harmful. And it is an easy path. The wide way is to be a person who's all loving, but you compromise truth, or to be a truth teller that doesn't show compassion. The way of Jesus that is straight and narrow and more difficult is to hold both of these in equal value. Speak the truth in love. Be a person who bears grace and truth. We are called to hold these two in tension and to hold these two in balance. As I close, I want to share with you a quote from the authors Henry Cloud and John Townsend. They wrote a book called How to Have a Difficult Conversation. And here's what they say, quote, "Many of us live in two worlds when it comes to relationships. In one world, we have friendly conversations in which we avoid all disagreements. In the other world, we have major conflict type conversations where we tear everybody and everything up. In the first world, we have connection without truth. And in the second, we have truth without connection. God did not design us to live in these two worlds. God did not design us to live this way, having two types of relationships. He wants us to live in one world where we live with both the truth and with love coexisting as allies, not as adversaries. Our connections are best when they are truthful, and our truth is best when we are connected. The Bible calls this truth and love. Conversations work best when people both care for each other and tell the truth to each other. Good things happen. People get along, resolve issues, and still maintain the connection that they need. And I'm convinced that Cloud and Townsend are right about that. Now, practically, we know how challenging that can be. Again, I admit it to you, it is much easier to do one or the other, to live in one world or the other. But the way of Christ is the more difficult way, the narrow path, the higher ground, the bigger standard, the heavenly calling, the kingdom life that He calls us to is to walk the balance and hold the tension between being a person who values and expresses and sees the need for empathy, but also has healthy boundaries in the relationships with one another as we encounter each other. What we're called to, church, in our one anothering is empathetic boundaries.